All right, everyone. I think we've got a critical mass of folks joining us. Welcome to the launch of the California Preservation Next Academy. We're really excited to have all of you join us today to talk about small to medium multifamily preservation. My name is Sarah Haas. I'm a senior director with Enterprise, and just so excited to have all of you here with us today. Today, I am joined by my colleagues, Caroline McCormick, Director of Preservation in our Northern California office, Ruby Harris, Senior Director of Capital Solutions and Partnerships in our Southern California office, Jesse Wang, our Preservation Next Fellow, Judy Kendi, our Senior Program Officer, our Senior Chief Program Officer with Enterprise Community Partners, and three amazing local partners that you will meet shortly in today's call. We're really so excited to publicly launch Preservation Next, which will advance the preservation of unsubsidized affordable homes and promote housing stability by offering developers and housing providers tools and training, technical assistance and grants, and capital resources to acquire, rehabilitate, and preserve the affordability of small to medium multifamily properties. As we jump into our session, I just want to note a few quick housekeeping items. First, we are recording the session and we will share the registration with all participants and registrants. Second, we ask that you use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen for any questions. We also do have the chat open. Feel free to use that to introduce yourself. Would love to know who's on the call or for any quick kind of more logistical questions. So now, just want to give you a quick overview of our agenda. So first, we're going to give an overview of Preservation Next. So what is this program? Why are we doing it? We'll then do a quick walkthrough of our Preservation Toolkit, which is also launching today. We'll be able to hear about our preservation work in our Northern California and Southern California markets. And then we're going to do a deep dive into the local work with our panel discussion from three amazing local partners who will meet a little later in our session. We'll end with just a quick preview of our next session. So before we move into that, I just want to give a huge thank you to our funders. So first, our work was seeded by a grant from Mackenzie Scott, which was truly transformational in bringing this to fruition. I'd also like to thank Kaiser Permanente for their amazing support, which will support our academies and toolkit work in California, Colorado, and Georgia. And also want to thank CIT Bank for their support in launching this work. So before we jump into the content of our session, really excited to have a welcome from Judy Kendi, our Senior Vice President and Chief Program Officer with Enterprise. So Judy.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Hi, everyone. As Sarah said, my name is Judy Kendi. I'm Chief Program Officer for Enterprise Community Partners, and it is really my great privilege to welcome all of you to our first meeting of the Preservation Next Academy. We could not be more thrilled to be launching this. We are here today because America is facing a massive shortage of affordable rental homes. The COVID-19 pandemic has compounded this crisis, leaving 1 in 4 renters struggling to pay their rent. So preserving affordable homes and supporting both their residents and landlords is our priority here at Enterprise. And through Preservation Next, we are committed to preserving small, medium, multifamily affordable homes and ensuring that residents have access to safe, healthy, and resilient places to live. Small and medium-sized properties provide a crucial foundation for affordable housing in this country. 80% of homes in smaller buildings are available to people who earn less than 80% of the area median income. And as many of you are aware, smaller buildings have some unique challenges. They're often older, meaning more maintenance and upkeep. They're also often in neighborhoods where prices are climbing. So to preserve these homes, we have to invest in properties and protect affordability for residents now and into the future. We have to protect existing affordability, and we have to protect housing stability and prevent displacement of existing residents and families. We must invest in healthy, sustainable, and resilient homes, and we need to foster responsible stewardship by mission-aligned owners. And that is why we're so excited to launch California Preservation Next Academy with all of you. And it's worth repeating, we could not do this work without our funders. So thank you to Kaiser Permanente, CIT Bank, JP Morgan Chase, and Mackenzie Scott. And thanks to all of you for joining today.
All right, thank you so much, Judy. I really appreciate your support and leadership of this work. All right, so we are now going to jump back in and talk a little bit about the program that we're here to learn more about today. So Preservation Next was developed by a team across all of Enterprise's divisions with input from local partners across our markets. And it's led by me, along with Megan Vilkovic, who is our senior advisor, and Jesse Wang, our preservation fellow, who you'll hear from shortly. Preservation Next will catalyze and support small multifamily preservation and housing stability efforts across the country through a three-pronged approach. Just a quick note, we are focused on small to medium multifamily affordable housing, which for us, we're defining as properties between 2 and 49 units, which can be found in urban, suburban, and rural communities across the country, and are a critical source of affordable housing for low and moderate income households. So I want to highlight too that we're not just focused on the preservation of the building stock with this program, but also on the housing stability of residents. Just want to highlight the 3 pillars of work under Preservation Next. So first, we're here, of course, to launch the Preservation Academy for California today. Our Preservation Academies will be regional and will be a series of trainings with the goal of building developer capacity to jumpstart or accelerate preservation activities in regions across the country. After California, we'll head to Colorado in early 2023 and the Southeast region of the US in mid-2023. In addition to all of the participants we have on with us today, we're excited to welcome our Preservation Next Academy cohort, made up of 15 nonprofit developers selected through an RFP process, who seek to catalyze and grow their small multifamily preservation efforts. We'll be working with them over the next 6 to 9 months with grant support, technical assistance, and additional deep dive training. In addition, you'll be seeing the first view of the National Preservation Toolkit we're launching today. This toolkit is an online resource to equip developers, partners, housing providers, and others with best practices and guidance to acquire, rehabilitate, and preserve the long-term affordability of small to medium multifamily homes. And then lastly, I want to highlight a partnership that we have with Enterprise Community Loan Fund. We are launching a pilot small to medium multifamily loan product targeted towards the financing needs of this critical affordable housing stock. This will pilot initially in Atlanta, New Orleans, and the Mid-Atlantic regions. But in our other markets, we'll be continuing to work with our partners to access existing resources and new resources which may be coming online. Next slide. So I just want to give you a quick highlight of the California Preservation Next Academy sessions. Anais will be putting the link actually in the Q&A. We do note that the chat function is disabled, and apologies for that. So please do use the Q&A for your question needs for this session. Our goal with the Preservation Next sessions is to have attendees learn about tools and practices you can employ locally, to hear from local and national practitioners and experts on their efforts to preserve small to medium multifamily housing, and really to follow kind of the full process of preserving these properties. Just to give you some quick highlights of where we're going. In 2 weeks, we'll focus on organizational sustainability and business planning. So making sure that organizations and companies are considering, whether they're ready for this work and how it aligns with their priorities and mission. Next, we'll dive into acquisition, from there focusing on financing, and then to rehabilitation factors and practices, which will be followed by a deep dive into sustainability, resilience, and health factors and considerations in this work. We'll spend 2 sessions on different preservation business models, with a second of those sessions being a real focus on CLTs. And our last few sessions will be focused on policy, property and asset management, and housing stability. Registration links are now live for those first 4 sessions, with the remainder coming soon. And so I encourage you to check out the link, which will be popped into the Q&A so that you can go ahead and register for those. So now, excited that we are going to go ahead and give a peek into the Preservation Next Toolkit. I'm going to pass to Jesse Wang, our Preservation Fellow, who'll be walking us through.
Hi, everyone. As Sarah stated, my name is Jessie. I'm a fellow with Preservation Next. I'm excited to announce the launch of Enterprise's Preservation Next Toolkit, which is focused on small to mid-sized properties. This toolkit is an online resource with guidance and tools for different audiences advancing preservation, including developers and land trusts who are purchasing and rehabbing these properties, practitioners and advocates who are creating and implementing preservation programs, and also existing owners who are looking for resources to stabilize, manage, and continue to operate their properties. So right now, I'm going to walk through our toolkit and provide a high-level overview of its contents. So our introduction really sets the stage by framing the importance of preservation, especially importance for racial equity and why we care about this work. We also have a brief called By the Numbers, and this contextualizes the national small to mid-size housing stock. It describes residents who live in this housing and provides some context on the types of neighborhoods that have a large share of these properties. Our toolkit also provides what we're calling issue briefs that provide guidance and best practices around key aspects of and challenges of the preservation process. You can find these right here. I'm going to go over a brief overview of what these entail. So our brief on developer capacity has information on important organizational competencies for embarking on ACT rehab, such as business planning and securing financing. Our toolkit also includes key considerations for identifying and evaluating acquisition opportunities for preservation, such as property characteristics, local market conditions, and also neighborhood accessibility. Since these properties are often older, navigating the rehab process is a critical component of this work. Our rehab brief includes guidance to help you develop your rehab scope and budget, as well as resources to assess building conditions. Related to rehab, we also have a separate resource about key considerations to integrate green building, energy efficiency, resilience, and also health within preservation. Resident engagement is also a critical component of this work, as many of these properties are occupied. We have a brief on supporting and engaging residents, and also making the case for why broader community engagement is also important. Property management can be a big challenge, especially as many of these properties are smaller and scattered site. In our property management brief, kind of lays out potential models. And closing out description of our issue briefs, we also have an enabling environment brief, which just provides guidance for different stakeholders on how to advance preservation, and includes a policy inventory with examples across the country. So while the toolkit is national in scope, it also provides some local resources and tools. I just want to quickly highlight our state of the market briefs contextualize affordability challenges across the country in 8 different regions. Highlighting each region's small to mid-sized housing stock, as well as local preservation stakeholders and initiatives. We also have a funding resources inventory that lays out funding resources for ACT rehab in 10 different regions with information such as eligible dwelling types, administering entities, eligible uses, and links for more information. We also have a set of case studies so that you can see actual preservation projects. I just want to highlight 2 in California. This is one that was acquired by Fideicomiso and Little Tokyo Service Center in East LA. This project is in San Francisco's Tenderloin, acquired by TNDC. And lastly, I just want to highlight our financial modeling tool, where you can plug in a sample project's sources, uses to assess financial viability and we'll be adjusting this tool to account for local market assumptions. So this toolkit will serve as the foundation for our Academy session content. So stay tuned for future sessions to see how some of these tools and resources can be used. And I will pass it back to Sarah to introduce Ruby and Caroline.
Great. Thank you so much, Jesse. And just a couple notes, the chat is now on, so apologies for that. And we have posted the link to the preservation toolkit so that you can go ahead and check that out. That will be a continually evolving and growing tool that will be continuing to add local and regional resources and updates. So welcome your input and feedback on that tool as well. Thanks, Jesse. So we are now going to hear from our partners in Northern California and Southern California. Really excited to introduce Caroline McCormack, Director of Preservation for Enterprise's Northern California office, and Ruby Harris, Senior Director of Capital Solutions and Partnerships in Enterprise's Southern California market. Ruby brings 22 years of experience in the community development field, including launching the San Francisco Small Sites Preservation Program. And Caroline previously managed preservation and anti-displacement financing programs in the San Francisco Mayor's Office and brings underwriting, program design, and policy expertise to our work. So I am now going to pass to Ruby to kick us off.
Thanks, Sarah, and hi to everyone who's joined us here today. I'm very pleased to be here with you. I wanted to kick us off by just talking a little bit more broadly about why unsubsidized SMMF preservation is so important in the affordable housing landscape. So I'm just going to do a little bit of framing here, and then we'll get back into LA focused and Southern California focused work. SMMF preservation is both faster and more cost effective than new construction. And so estimates are that it costs about 50% of the amount it costs to do a new unit through SMMF preservation. It's also quicker. It takes 1 to 2 years to get a unit online, if not faster, depending on the complexity of the project, versus 4 to 5 years for a new construction project. SMMF, as we've highlighted already earlier today, also really is a key component to slowing displacement and keeping residents in place and their communities intact. And I like to think of that not only about the residents who, of course, are the focus of our work and who've maybe been in their units 30, 40 years, but I also like to think about it more broadly as far as the rest of the neighborhood and maintaining neighborhood connectivity for small businesses, for nonprofits, for other job centers that are focused and reliant on the residents as well. And then the other thing that we don't talk about enough as far as SMMF preservation is that it really slows down NIMBYism, because generally NIMBYism is fueled by a fear of new residents coming to a neighborhood or a new building being sited there. And so it really quiets that down because most people can get behind wanting to have their neighbors stay in place. And so we find that as like another very exciting piece of why SMMF is faster, more cost effective, and retains that neighborhood connectivity. And then finally, the SMMF units really comprise a large portion of all affordable housing units across the country. And we honestly are losing them much faster than we are able to build new. And so in the next slide, I'll share with you what that means in practice with the numbers. Here in the state, well, let me back up. In the United States, 75% of all affordable housing units are the SMMF type, unsubsidized SMMF. In the state of California, we have a full 1.134 million units of unsubsidized affordable SMMF, which represents 70% of all of our affordable housing units in California. And then drilling back down to LA County, about 500,000 of our units here in LA County are SMMF type, and 80% that comprises 80% of all of our affordable stock. And if you look at it even more with a fine-tooth comb, 62% of our 500,000 SMMF units are in neighborhoods that are comprised of the majority people of color. And so when we're thinking about SMMF preservation, it's really important to also look at it through a racial equity lens, There's a reason why these units remain affordable and in these formerly redlined neighborhoods. And we want to make sure that we are slowing down the harm that is happening in those neighborhoods. Between 2010 and 2019, we lost a full 111,000 units of SMMF in LA County. That's about 12,000 a year that was lost during that time frame. And in the same time frame, we built 13,000. So we've got a very leaky bucket, and we've got to work on plugging up that hole. And finally, just to mention the Bay Area as another highly populated area in California and round out sort of what the numbers look like in California. Caroline will talk a little bit more about this later, but the Bay Area's got 280,000 units of SMMF remaining, and they've lost a significant amount recently, with over 32,000 a year between 2012 and 2017. So that really, those are scary numbers. Those are big numbers, but it's why we're focused on the work and on the people who live in all of these units. And so now drilling down into enterprises work here in Southern California, we really are focused on a broad range of preservation activities, and we work on everything from permanently supportive housing up through community land trust and unsubsidized preservation, and also working with small property owners. We do our work by advancing programmatic capital and policy solutions that support that broad range of affordable housing priorities. And specifically for preservation in 2023 and beyond, we're really looking at how to open more of the spigots to these funding sources that support the preservation in our region, and roll out new funding sources in a way that is applicable and supportive of the developers who are working in preservation. So I listed a couple of the funding sources that are coming up right now. United to House LA is up on the ballot next week, and we'll find out if that will be available. But if so, it will bring in a lot of money for preservation. We are working closely with our Northern California colleagues on how to roll out the foreclosure intervention housing preservation program here in our LA office. And then we are working closely with HCD on the portfolio reinvestment program, which has more to do with the existing affordable stock. In addition to that, we're looking at pulling together a preservation convening in Southern California to really think together about what barriers to preservation exist in the region and what opportunities we might have together. And so that includes the city and county of Los Angeles, who we have a strong partnership, and also, work with community-based organizations in those two areas, but is broader than that, right? Because what we do affects everybody else and vice versa. So really thinking about it in a very broad-based stakeholder convening to talk through those barriers and opportunities. And then finally, as I mentioned before, we think about preservation in a pretty broad way, in a broad spectrum. And part of that is supporting BIPOC small property owners who own a large portion of the SMMF buildings, especially in South LA, and really supporting them to keep those assets in local hands, which could include themselves keeping the assets in their families, but also thinking about sort of a responsible transfer of ownership when they are ready to sell, and how those buildings can be transferred to other local partners and cause less harm to the residents who are currently there, and keep the affordability that is in place. So with that, I'm going to pass it along to Caroline, who will talk about Northern California.
Great. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm really honored to share a little bit about our preservation priorities in Northern California. I think before sort of diving into some of the background on where our work started and where our priorities are today, I want to start out by saying so much of this work is and has been rooted in the collaborative spaces that we share with so many of the folks who are on this call right now. Dozens of people and organizations on this webinar who identified and organized around the loss of homes of low-income people of color in San Francisco, in Oakland, across the South Bay. And, I think although we're using this language of building typology of small multifamily properties, I really think it's important for us to continue to visualize the people, the families living there, and that being really what drove us to start having these conversations at the local and regional level about what it would look like to design and fund anti-displacement preservation programs to really stem this tide. So I'm not going to go too deep on the data because Ruby did a great job of that. I just have this slide up to say that we really started in those collaborative spaces in Oakland and San Francisco. And then in 2020, we took a first pass at quantifying the loss of unsubsidized affordable homes in the Bay Area to begin that case-making process for why preservation needs to be prioritized as an anti-displacement affordable housing strategy. And I think the paper really honed in on some key issues. Number one, there's limited funding and financial tools to do this work, and these projects rely on, often significant public subsidy, and really there's only a couple of pots across the region of, a couple $1 million here, a couple $1 million there, and that's really not enough to really address the scale of the issue. Secondly, I think critical finding from that report was that we need to support the capacity building for the preservation ecosystem. And that means through things like Preservation Next, but also investing in capacity building grants for folks to staff up and really sort of catalyze the work at the organizational level. And then third, we also need those complementary policies like COPA and TOPA to give the field a competitive advantage to getting these affordable homes off the speculative market. And so that report really laid the groundwork for our priorities. So you can go to the next slide. So this takes us to today. This slide is, I think, a good recap of what we're working on here in Northern California. I think number one, securing funding. We want you to know that Preservation Next is not happening in a vacuum here in California, that capacity building is a key piece of the equation, but we need the capital. We're building the capacity towards also securing the capital. So just lifting up a couple examples of where and how we're doing that. We have our $10 to $20 billion Bay Area Housing Finance Authority bond measure, regional bond measure that we're angling for the 2024 ballot with. WAFA is staffed up now, and we need to get them the money to build out a preservation program. 15% of that regional bond would go to preservation. So the huge number of resources into the region. Similarly, we're going to run our $500 million community anti-displacement preservation program proposal again in the next budget cycle, and that will support state level funding for acquisition, rehab, and so many of the folks on this webinar are part of those coalitions. Just lifting up a couple more examples, we're co-administering the Partnership for the Bay's Future with the San Francisco Foundation and Coro, Northern California, where we're supporting 11 amazing fellows. I see some of you on the call who are placed in local governments across the Bay Area to really catalyze tenant and community-centered affordable housing policies at the local level. About half of those fellows are actually working on preservation specifically. So that's, I think, really exciting that infrastructure is being built. So then when we get that regional bond, local governments can move on those. We've also got our eye on the success of programs like the Foreclosure Intervention Housing Preservation Program, which Ruby mentioned. That's launching next year. That's 1 to 25 unit buildings at a foreclosure risk. So I won't go too deep into more of these examples, but I just wanted to end with a few final thoughts. I think the preservation space is incredibly inspiring and important work because these are new strategies for our field, and we're seeing new partners, many of which are deeply rooted in community and BIPOC-led. And I think Preservation Next is really focused on nurturing the space and building those partnerships. We also are really intent on lifting up a diverse set of development models and building types, from rental housing to shared equity models, 1 to 4 unit buildings, up to 90 unit SROs, like is featured in one of the case studies. I think with an eye toward figuring out how we can own and operate these affordable homes for generations to come. And I think a crucial part of that I can't wait to dig into is figuring out, what are the real challenges that some of these buildings face and the real risks that an organization might be taking on and engaging in this work. And so I think we're excited for this space to be generative and to seed and inform new policies and programs to really explore some of those pain points and do some collective problem solving around it. So I think we're going to go deep. We certainly don't have all the answers, but we really want this space to rely on our collective expertise, and we're really excited to dig into it with you. So I think with that, we're going to move on to the panel discussion. So a reminder that you can submit questions via the Q&A. So please feel free to do that. We've got our own set of questions, but really looking for engagement from the audience. And we've got some amazing partners that bring so much expertise and depth and heart into their preservation work. And I'm just going to introduce them real quick, and then we'll move into presentations and then follow with the Q&A. So first we'll hear from Aubrey Levine, Vice President of Real Estate Development at the Oakland-based Unity Council, who brings 15 years of experience developing affordable housing in the Bay Area, having overseen the development and preservation of 1,000 affordable homes. After that, we'll hear from Monica Mejia from East Los Angeles Community Corporation, who has also spent decades working in the affordable housing space, overseeing 750 units of affordable housing, tenant services, and community wealth programs, including supporting small businesses and street vendors. And last but not least, we'll hear from Roberto Garcia Ceballos, co-founder and co-director of Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre. Roberto is a community and cultural organizer and strategist based in Los Angeles, bringing a decade of experience in housing rights, community land trusts, and equitable land use development. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Aubrey to kick us off.
Great, thank you all. Thanks to Enterprise and the Preservation Next team for inviting me to be here. I'm really excited to talk about our preservation work and to hopefully engage in a conversation with you all about that. So first, just a little bit about the Unity Council. We are a social equity development corporation founded in the 1960s. We serve over 10,000 clients annually in 5 different languages, and those program areas range from early childhood education through our Head Start services, through youth mentorship and leadership working in Oakland middle and high schools. We have career and workforce development programs, economic development programs supporting over 300 small businesses in the commercial corridor in the areas we work, senior services, and a number of community programs and events, and of course, affordable housing. And our affordable housing work includes new construction, preservation, and then we also work in a non-housing space and community-focused projects. So next slide. Just to center folks who are not familiar with the Bay Area, the Fruitvale neighborhood is in East Oakland. It's the yellow area highlighted there. The red is the East Oakland kind of the East Oakland geography, and that's where we focus our preservation activities. We are a community-based organization, and so we do try to align our housing activities where we're working with other services. Just a little bit more about the Fruitvale and East Oakland. Similar to some of the statistics that were shared earlier, the Fruitvale is heavily renter households. 60% of the households are renter. It's lower income. The population is heavily Hispanic with large Asian and Black populations. And that distribution is consistent for the Fruitvale and all of East Oakland. The Fruitvale is pretty dense. It's twice as dense as Oakland as a whole, has a slightly younger population, and 33% of the adult population does not speak English well, and that's in large part due to the high number of immigrants living in the Fruitvale, many of whom are undocumented. So that's a little bit about where we work, and I want to talk about kind of why we do this work. Many of these were mentioned earlier. It's not surprising, as you all know, California is facing a massive housing shortage. So just kind of baseline, we're doing this to preserve the supply of affordable housing. I thought it was interesting, the National Housing Trust says that for every new apartment created, and this is nationwide, 2 are lost to deterioration or abandonment or conversion to more expensive housing. And based on the statistics that Ruby shared earlier, it sounds like the loss is even greater in California, and we can't afford to lose any more units. So that's number one. We also know that housing is incredibly expensive. As you can see from this chart, the average income needed to afford a $2,400 a month 2-bedroom apartment in Alameda County is quite substantial and out of reach for many hardworking members of the community. So, and we also know that those who earn the least are the hardest hit. So households that are cost burdened spend 30% of their income on housing costs, more than 30% of their income on housing costs. Households that are severely cost burdened spend more than 50% of their income on housing costs. And as you can see, it's a pretty high, the numbers increase as income decreases. And so one of the other reasons that we do this work is to alleviate cost burden households, to try to preserve affordability where we can, and to right size rent to income as much as possible so that households don't have to choose between rent and spending on food and utilities, medicine, transportation, all of the other important things that they need in their lives. And that leads into the final and perhaps most important point of why we do this work, is really to improve the quality of life for residents by creating safer and healthier living environments. So a little bit about our acquisition strategy. Quite simply, 2 to 3 properties annually. We're looking at ideally buildings that are more than 50 units. I know the focus of this conversation is buildings that are less than 50 units. Buildings that are more than 50 units are hard to find. And so often what we do is look at buildings that are, hopefully 25 to 50 units, and ideally a portfolio that would get us above 50 units. And again, our work is geographically focused in East Oakland. So I want to talk a little bit about a portfolio acquisition that we did in 2020, right as the pandemic was kicking off. It was an interesting time. It's a complete understatement, but in this world as well, and we learned a lot. In fact, we're still learning a lot. The stars at the bottom with these numbers, 1921, 2000, and 2022, represent 3 properties that we purchased all in one block, totaling 80 units. So the first of those properties was 1921 36th Avenue. It's 8 units, 1 and 2 bedroom apartments. The building was built in the early 1940s, and we acquired this property with a combination. The acquisition was with a combination of funds from the Preservation Bay Futures Fund and a line of credit, and then the city of Oakland came in to take out the line of credit. Next, we had 2022 36th Ave, same financing. It's 17 units, 1 and 2 bedrooms. And it was the building was built a little later in the 1959, and it's directly adjacent to the third building, which is 2036 Ave. 2036 Ave is the largest property, 55 units. It was acquired with assistance from the Enterprise Bay Area Preservation Pilot Program. City of Oakland and the Housing for Health Equity Fund. This has probably been biggest challenge and in some ways our biggest success. It's a challenge because the financing environment changed kind of as we were acquiring it and shortly thereafter, and our kind of anticipated, the building is not in great shape. It has a lot of rehab needs, and we had anticipated being able to do a full scale kind of tax credit rehab, and unfortunately that's looking less and less like a feasible option. And so figuring out how to address those needs, which didn't go away because the financing did, has been a challenge, as well as many other lessons learned, which we can get into later. But an effort to end on a high note, I want to bring it back to the residents and talk about some of the successes here, which is that we've also been able to bring a lot of resources to this property, to all three properties actually, but given space consideration, most of the activities are held in this area. So the top picture, there's a lot of families here. After school programming and resident services are fully embedded now as part of the kind of daily activities. There's a ton of kids who participate, and families are engaging in other ways. We've brought nurses from a local college to help with health counseling. And finally, this last summer, we were able to partner with Kaboom, Eat, Learn, Play, and Riddle to do a playground, really a whole courtyard makeover. So the top picture is what it looked like when we purchased it. And the bottom pictures are some of the activity, the build happening this summer. We were able to build an actual playground, community garden beds, and a trellis for some folks to sit under. That was one of the requirements. The residents were very much involved in the design of the project and, shared with us what they wanted to see. And then we were able to include them in the building as well, a volunteer build. And it was a really wonderful few days. And it's been very well utilized. So it's really wonderful to kind of see the transformation that's occurred there. And that's where I'll end. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Abra. So we are now going to, let me just switch this up. All right, I'm excited to introduce Monica with ELAC to talk to us about your work in this space. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everybody. So glad to be here. Thank you to Enterprise. It's a tremendous privilege to be part of this incredible group and focus. So I'll tell you a little bit about ELAC. ELAC is like a 27-year nonprofit. We're located in Boyle Heights, and we serve Boyle Heights and East LA neighborhood in Los Angeles. And you can see our mission on the screen. We have pretty much two primary programs. We have a community capital program and a community services program. And the community capital program includes both tax credit projects and what we call the unrestricted portfolio, which is a bunch of NOAA buildings that we acquired maybe 15 years ago to 7 years ago. We also have commercial properties, and we have tax credit projects in development right now. And our other side of our work is our community services work, and this involves financial coaching. We do businesses, individuals, we do housing counseling. We're a HUD-approved housing counselor. We also do a monthly mobile food pantry, resident services. We do tax prep. And we do a lot of small business counseling, in particular with street vendors and money achievers. Next slide, please. So, actually, I can't see the top of it. So we are preparing to launch a preservation program. And we've been preparing all through 22. And the preparation will continue into 2023 with the intent to fully launch it in 2023. And our objective over the next 3 to 4 years is to acquire approximately 13 properties in the Boyle Heights, East LA neighborhoods. The ones we're looking are the smaller ones, maybe 5 to 15 units. In particular, I'm interested in looking for ones that are, most of our properties over here are subject to the rent stabilization ordinance. And that is for buildings that are older than 1978. And that's most of the housing stock in the neighborhood here. And what I find with those buildings is that they really need a rehab. And so the idea is to finally provide a safe, comfortable home for the folks who live there who, due to like market pressures and landlords, market rate landlords, the buildings have not been kept up. And so those are the buildings I'm most interested in rehabbing. We're also, the program is going to include a home ownership option, basically a cooperative housing option for one of the 10 properties that we would do. And we're in a good spot to do that because we do have the financial counseling programs already in-house here at ELAC. One thing about the rehab is that one of the important things is our neighborhood's hot. And we have problems with poor air quality here. We're surrounded by 4 different freeways, and we have heat sink problems. And so it's really important for us when we do the rehab to make sure that the buildings are designed, or the rehabilitation includes components that improve the quality of life, the livability, the ability to endure and resist global warming. And climate resilience has to be a part of the rehab. And for me, I'm hoping that that includes some solar panels, really well insulated buildings. That way folks can use their HVAC systems to access the heat, the air conditioning they need to access, and not stress about the electric bill coming due. So that's part of the equity aspect of the rehab program that we're hoping to do. And so the idea is to improve the quality of life for the residents. They'll have a healthier building, which, healthier for themselves. They'll have long-term stabilized rents, which would be kept at the rent stabilization ordinance levels. And then in addition, that would also help them have their own funding available for other living needs. And then they finally have a long-term stability. Because our neighborhood here is subject to a lot of gentrification pressures. We're only about 2 miles from downtown Los Angeles. And so what's happening here is that market rate folks are buying our homes, our small apartment buildings, and turning them into high-end market rate housing for the short commuters that would commute into downtown. And so we're losing our rent stabilized apartments. And so we're hoping to stabilize that. This is a strategy to try to preserve the character of the neighborhood before it completely changes due to gentrification. So next slide, please. So this is basically kind of a timeline of how the process might look. In the first year, which is year 2022, 2023, it goes into 2024. We would sort of launch the program, we'd hire some staff, and we'd start looking into some of the properties that are available on the market. We've already been doing that. So we have a sense of what's available on the market and approximate cost to buy them, approximate cost per unit. But, everything changes quickly. So, once we get going, we would update all of our market options, and we would start getting ready to purchase the properties. I'll talk a little bit about some of the funding sources that are coming online that are going to allow us to do that. Actually, if you can go back a minute more to the prior slide, please. Thank you. So the idea is to buy the properties fairly quickly. And so we can get them from basically sellers that are looking for market rate developers to come in, and we need to compete with those developers. And so for us to do that, we need to access acquisition money quickly. During that time that we're trying to buy the building, we're going to have to do due diligence also very quickly. And we have to start meeting with our residents, and we have to start developing our scope of work, prepare our construction contracts, and prepare our temporary relocation plan. A lot of the work that we do, well, many times requires that someone might have to go to a hotel or a comparable apartment for a period of time, maybe 1 week, maybe 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks if the rehab in that particular apartment is really extensive. So this is sort of kind of a very schematic timeline. We basically issue notice to proceed. We go into construction for about 1 to 4 months. Here in our area of Los Angeles, we have to do a lot of accessibility upgrades. And so we will have to do a CAS clearance, which is a process for us. And it's really tricky to do here in LA. And it's very tricky with ag rehabs too. And then the idea is that once we're done with the rehab, we'd be looking to put on a permanent loan on the property. Right now, the idea is that we would pick up 2 buildings in the first year. And in the second year, we would double up. We'd double up the staff and double up the number of buildings. And in the third year, we would finish it out and to try to get to 13 buildings all together. Would you mind going to the next slide, please? Thanks. So there at the top there, you can see we're basically looking at 2 sites in the first year. A lot of our buildings here are about $1 million to $2 million. So we kind of just struck it in the middle, going up from 2 sites to 5 sites to 6 sites in year 3. We need funding for due diligence. We need funding for the rehab and the temporary relocation, and we need funding for the staffing. And we have been looking into sources and doing presentations on this program to try to assemble sources and try to prepare for some of the funding sources that are coming online. Over here in the red on the right, you'll see we have here in LA, we have something on the ballot. It's called United to House LA. And if it passes in November, there's a component of that funding that is available for this kind of work, acquisition and preservation work. And I'm hoping that we're going to have to talk to the city of LA because it's going to run through the city, not the county, about making sure that it's available on an efficient timeline. And that's always the tricky part, is trying to get the money to flow as fast as we need it to flow in order to compete with market rate buyers. The other program that's coming down the line is called FIP, and it's a program from the state of California. And that program is getting close to launching as well. We expect it to launch early next year in 2023. And that is a funding source that would be available for us to buy the properties in the county of LA versus the city of LA. So just to quickly summarize, we're already doing quite a bit of work already in our portfolio. We've been engaged in this decarbonization work where we've took on 4 projects in our portfolio, and we're working on decarbonizing them. We're working with some consultants to try to make them more energy efficient and try to transfer the savings of the energy efficiency to the tenants. We've also this is some of the work we've done to kind of prepare to launch this program for the last year, 2022. We basically engaged in learning sessions with our executive team, our asset management team, and our property management team. We have 3 asset managers and 3, almost 4 property managers. And so that we're basically staffed up to receive these properties, receive the ownership, custodianship of these properties, and manage them long term. And as the portfolio grows, we would probably have to pick up more staff as well. We basically have a rough pro forma at this point for a cooperative housing model. We have 1 building that we are taking in that direction right now, and we have to engage in a tenant engagement plan to start that process. The decarbonization program is, as I mentioned, it's underway. And then we also work with a local broker to gather market data and help us access the properties quickly. So that's basically where ELAC is in launching its preservation program.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Well, we'll move it over to Roberto to round us out, and then we'll move to the Q&A.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Roberto. I'm the co-director of Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre. Fideicomiso is a community land trust in East LA and Boyle Heights, and we're also members of the LA CLT Coalition and the California Community Land Trust Network, which are really important in terms of the presentation that I'm going to cover today. So Fideicomiso was founded in 2018 by community residents and community-based organizations. We've, we're, like Monica said earlier, we're concentrated in a community or communities that have been disinvested and impacted by for-profit development and just negligence in terms of city and county and state. And so, our community came together to really think through alternatives to the housing crisis and really how to prevent displacement from the housing crisis that was happening and is still happening today. And so if we go to the next slide, please. And so when the pandemic actually happened, Fideicomiso was kind of left in a position, in a very vulnerable position as a new organization. And we had to strategically develop partnerships. And so Community Power Collective is a community-based organization, also a new organization that is dedicated to organizing power building, and specifically with street vendors and with tenants in the neighborhood. And then we've had a partner with Little Tokyo Service Center and Restore Neighborhoods LA here in East to really think through how we're going to preserve housing, land. And so I'll talk more about what kind of evolved. And so if we go to the next slide, please. So as the pandemic happened, Fideicomiso and other CLTs and other affordable housing developers came together, really thinking about, and other community-based organizations thinking about what's going to happen after, like during this pandemic, because we know the implications on the health of our community, but the economy. And we know from learning from 2008 that, the turnover of wealth, the turnover of theft in our community by corporate, landlord, banks, and other was pretty intense. And so we didn't want to replicate that. And we wanted to make sure there was stability in our neighborhood. And so we attempted to get ARP funding to our community so that we could have an acquisition program. And we went to our county supervisors and our city reps to really think through what would be an acquisition program, not only for Boyle Heights and East LA, but really thinking through the county and the city as a whole. And how do we build a preservation program that really thinks and implements something that's going to give us a just recovery for the county. And so we were unsuccessful at getting ARP money, but because Fideicomiso had a really strong relationship and many of the other CLTs had relationships with our supervisors, county supervisors, and the county having an affordable housing trust fund, we were able to get $14 million to implement a CLT pilot program. There's actually 2 pilot programs, but I'm only focusing on this one. And this one specifically for us to acquire small multifamily units, and the purchase and that we needed to have 150 to 350 per unit price, and that we co-created the guidelines around what buildings would be acquired, specifically based on the conditions of displacement and preventing displacement, and looking at high concentration, like areas that were really experiencing high displacement. And our our income targets were 30 to 80% AMI. And so this pilot was actually we just finished our first round of the pilot program, where our last building was acquired a couple months ago, and 8 buildings were acquired with 5 CLTs, which are El Sereno CLT, Fideicomiso, Beverly Vermont Community Land Trust, Liberty Community Land Trust, and Trust South LA. And we worked with community development corporations that were mission aligned and really thought through and are really investing in community ownership in the county of LA. And so some of those are Habitat for Humanity, Little Tokyo Service Center, which we work with, Brilliant Corners, Venice Community Housing. And we also work with our partners from Spark LA and Spark National, Genesis, in creating a $500,000 recoverable grant for us to acquire buildings. And so this required more partnership, and it requires more partnership because we're actually building a regional infrastructure for the county and for this and for the city. And so it's not really around just like acquiring buildings in one neighborhood, but it's really thinking about how our region has an infrastructure that is like ready to be deployed in the preservation of tenants and families living throughout the county. And so the partnerships look like we have community land trusts that designed the program, advocate for resources, ID'd and convened partners, and acquired land stewardship, and acquire and steward the land. We have mission aligned CDCs that train CLT staff, support acquisition rehab, and have initial property management for some cases, not all. And then we have the public sector. So LA County providing the $14 million for us to acquire and rehab the buildings. And we're actually considering an expansion very soon, where potentially we'll have another $14 million. And then, like I said earlier, philanthropy was really involved as well, where we were able to fund CLT advocacy, get capacity building, fund operations, and access capital. And then we have our capital partners that provided flexible capital accessible to our BIPOC-led CLTs for all stages of pre-development and through stewardship. And so these are some of the examples of the buildings that were acquired. And so if we go to the next slide. And so I just wanted to go through like how we acquired our Simmons building. And so, this took about, our acquisition took about 4 months. But we're still going through the rehab. And so from January to April of 2001, the LA CLT Coalition did a lot of advocacy around getting the pilot program started. In the meantime, Community Power Collective and Fideicomiso had done a lot of research IDing buildings that are being sold. And specifically, our priority was to make sure that folks living in these buildings had access to tenant rights and knowing that they couldn't, and making sure that they knew that they couldn't be evicted during the pandemic. At the same time, Little Tokyo Service Center and Fideicomiso made an offer on the building. And then in May of 2021, we were able to acquire the building. We had our first tenant meeting, where Fideicomiso, Little Tokyo, and CPC formally introduced ourselves. And we had a huge attendance and involvement of the tenant and the household, the tenants and the households. And then in June 2021, we really started going deeper in terms of the organizing and relationship building that we with the tenants, specifically bringing in cultural organizing, holding a block party, and then building like a stronger connection to the households. If we could go to the next slide, please. And then since then on, we have monthly meetings where all 3 organizations attend, and specifically are building trust with tenants and education, specifically creating education around what community land trusts are, what their tenants' rights are, and having tenants be engaged in the rehab of the building. And so, those meetings are really complex in terms of, it's about really trying to empower tenants to embody the decision-making for themselves and the ownership of the building. And so in these meetings, we address condition issues, trust building, and allowing space for tenants to assert their rights as tenants. And for next year, our goal is to finalize our, we'll have folks temporarily be relocated and rehabilitate the building. And that's a very difficult task because we want to make sure that one of the priorities of the CLT pilot program with the county is for us to be able to transfer the building over to the tenants. And so for us, being separated from the tenants is a big risk, but it's something that needs to be done. And it's only a temporary relocation. But in the meantime, I think for us, that's a challenge of like, how do we hold the momentum we have in building with tenants as they're away from their homes temporarily. And so that's kind of where we're at. It's a brief kind of description of what Fideicomiso is doing. Again, it wouldn't happen if we weren't strategically thinking in the relationship buildings that we have and the infrastructure that we're trying to build with other CLTs and other affordable housing developers. And it's also an invitation for folks who want to do this work in LA County. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
I think there's one more slide, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and so just on that, like if folks are interested in learning more about this CLT pilot program, Liberty Hill and LISAR and the California Endowment have released an independent report on our preservation program. And I think it's really important for folks in LA County, anywhere that want to get into preservation to read it, because I think preservation is a really essential thing. And for us, it's essential because in a lot of ways, it's a way for us to have some healing and some reparations around the disinvestment that happened in our communities and the redlining that happened in our communities. And so for us, I think this pilot program really shows and demonstrates the way that we could really apply the work of acquisition in a way that does like justice around many of the harms. And specifically for us, it's really important that when we open these walls, we understand how harmful it is to live in a NOAA building in our communities. And that's what folks have left in terms of where to go. And so for us, this is like just a key tool in terms of the affordable housing development that needs to happen, specifically around preservation and community ownership and home ownership. And so for us, I think that's for us, that's why it's so essential. And just to say that this pilot program is actually modeled in FIP. So the folks creating FIP have really engaged with the LACLT Coalition and the partners, including the county, around designing FIP, and that we're really engaged in the work that we're doing. And we're really engaged in ULA as well in terms of the design and making sure that there's a community ownership component working with CLTs around acquisition and rehab. So thank you. And now I'm finished. Thanks.
Okay, great. And you're getting a lot of double snaps plus in the chat. So everyone go check out that resource, and we'll try to pop it in the chat, the link in the chat as well. So thank you all for sharing a little bit about your organizations and your preservation work. We got a lot of questions and a lot of really good questions, so I won't go too far down my stock question rabbit hole, but I did want to just quickly, you dig into a little bit of the housing stock in your communities, and you talked a lot about kind of the physical conditions, so don't want to talk as much about that. But really talking a bit more about who's living in these homes, what challenges do they face, and then a little bit about your process for engaging residents, because I think the model can look different. Roberto talked a little bit about like the acquisition happening first and then kind of getting into the building and doing intensive resident meetings. I'm coming with a San Francisco hat on, which is like you need to have 2/3 of the residents on board before you even think about acquiring the building. So let's talk a little bit about how, you know, the residents you all are serving, and then how you're engaging in the acquisition, and then obviously throughout the rehab. So yeah, whoever wants to chime in first.
Well, I'll start. So when and I'll just kind of take this off of my experience. I've been doing acquisition rehabs for many years now. I've probably done over 300 apartments over the years, and so you know, when you first start to talk to the residents, you know, when you have to kind of like, you know, they've had a landlord who's been an abusive landlord many times. I mean, those are some of the buildings where kind of, for me, I'm trying to target and take away from that market situation. So they've had abusive landlords, and the risk of raising rents, the risk of getting kicked out, of getting an eviction happening, those are very real risks, and the risk of homelessness is very real. And so you do have folks who are in fear, and they don't necessarily trust who's coming in to buy the building. And so there is a process to build trust, to kind of explain, these are the new restrictions that are coming on. The rents are going to be restricted for at least 55 years, and that a remodel is coming. And sometimes the remodel is also, like, for some folks, they welcome it, and then for some it also creates anxiety. You know, temporary relocation is also a moment of anxiety too, because sometimes, like I said, we're building trust. They don't necessarily fully believe that they're going to come back to a remodeled apartment. So there has to be a lot of upfront conversations at the beginning about, you know, what the scope of work is going to be. And there's sort of like, there's two kinds of scopes of work. There's scope of work that's sort of essential for the long-term longevity of the building. If it needs a new roof, it needs a new roof, right? And then there's scope of work that is, that there's opportunities for folks to provide feedback on, you know, can we build more green space? What can we think about for the exterior paint colors? Is there enough? Then we start talking about what are really the needs here. How do you enter and exit the space? Where do you deal with garbage collection? What are some areas that you see need for improving, so that we can include that scope of work in the scope of work? And then you start the process. So it is a, you know, the one thing about rehabbing buildings is that every tenant situation is unique. So it's really hard to generalize. You have to talk to each individual household and figure out what their situation is. And sometimes we work with relocation consultants to do that if we have a huge building, because you know, it's so many details to track. But to make sure you treat each individual apartment as an individual with very specific needs. And if you do that, then you're more likely to have success in the process.
Anyone else want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, I just want to say that, like, our engagement is never around acquiring the building solely. I think for us, we have like monthly outreach to buildings that are being sold. And so for us, I think the priority is stabilizing through tenant rights and through tenant education. And so for us, if we're approaching a building, I think it's really important that folks aren't displaced, whether we buy it or not. And so the building being sold is already at risk of folks being displaced. One, because when buildings are being sold, they're at times rehabbed with the intention to increase rents, to relocate people, or to sell the building and leave the tenants in a vulnerable situation with a landlord that's going to continue to neglect their needs and their living conditions. And so for us, it's really important that tenants join a tenant association, are organized and know their rights, before we even think about talking about acquiring the building. And I think through organizing buildings, it's really important to make sure that we have a pipeline, that we understand what buildings need to be acquired long-term. But I think for us, that's a huge, I think a huge thing that needs to happen when we're thinking about acquiring buildings, that we just can't leave buildings vulnerable. Even if we're not going to acquire them, those tenants deserve and should have advocacy and empowerment to be able to defend themselves no matter what happens.
Thank you. Aubrey, do you want to chime in on that one too?
Yeah, I can chime in because I think, you know, we're targeting generally larger buildings, and often the owners that we're dealing with prohibit any conversation with residents during the due diligence or acquisition phase. So our first formal engagement with the residents is after we purchase the building. And that's a challenge. I mean, as Monica talked about, I mean, we're also dealing with trust building. Trust building is a huge component of that early work. And part of that is not just understanding the needs of the units and the physical needs of the building, but the needs of the tenants in their life, like, you know, health issues, what they want to see. So some of the work that I mentioned that we did at 2036 Avenue over the summer was in response to residents' kind of feedback around what they wanted to see at their property. But I think a lot of times the owners that we have engaged with are, you know, will be the first to tell you, like, we haven't raised the rent in 10 years. We're operating this as affordable. And then we walk through the property and we see kind of why they're able to operate it as affordable. And a lot of times the residents don't know that the conditions they're living in could be so much better. And so I think part of our work is to educate them about it and empower them to kind of advocate for those conditions. And that puts also more of an onus on us to give them those improved conditions. So, you know, it goes hand in hand. We definitely want to improve the quality of the apartments and to empower the residents. And that means that we have to be able to show up to do that work.
Right. Okay, well, I'll take one from the Q&A. We got a question about what is your site identification strategy? How do you know which properties to go after? Not everyone has to answer every question, but if you're feeling passionate about sharing your site identification strategy, please do chime in.
I mean, ours is, we're geographically focused. So first and foremost, that it's kind of in the neighborhood, and then financial feasibility, you know, our ability to operate it, and on the back end is the main driving component. And then looking at rehab need, trying to assess that as much as possible up front. And often we don't really know the full rehab picture until we've made an offer or are doing more intensive due diligence. But that's kind of how we go about looking at the properties.
Okay, well, let me actually move on to a question that was specifically for Monica. Someone from the chat wanted to know more about your organizational structure to support preservation work, like so getting into some of the nuts and bolts, how many FTE, PTE you're planning to staff up to work on preservation, and will they work solely on preservation, or is it going to be sort of a new construction preservation? mix, I guess. So if you could kick us off, and then if Roberto and Abra want to chime in on how you staff preservation, that'd be great.
Yeah, so as I mentioned here, we have 3 full-time property management staff. We actually are going to have 4 pretty soon. So we have 4 full-time property managers, and we have 3. We have 2 full-time asset managers, and then they're overseen by a supervisor who spends a good portion of his time on that too. And then in addition to that, I think we need another 2, probably 3 staff persons to kick it off. I think you guys saw with a 3-year layout. And so I thought initially start with 2 or 3 persons. And then in the second year, it would maybe double. So maybe it might be 5 staff persons. And then in the third year, it'd be 5 as well. And the idea is that it pretty much would be like 2 staff persons to handle the acquisition, the due diligence, the rehab, the temporary relocation, and a 3rd staff person that is more like a tenant advocate, more like the tenant's ally that's always there to make sure the tenant's needs are considered, especially with relocation. That's coming up. And so that was sort of the thinking. And then, depending on the efficiency of the group after year 1, if we double it, if they're going to pick up in year 2, if we're up to 6 buildings, so that's 3 for each team. And then, the question is whether the tenant coordinator could kind of cover both teams at that point. And so that's sort of the idea for the staffing. And they would just cover the ag rehabs. I mean, kind of what I was saying before, this work is, if you don't staff it up, it's labor intensive. And if you don't pay attention to the needs of the individual apartments, it's difficult to succeed. Because every apartment is different, every household is different, they all have different needs. And so it is sort of a one unit by unit, household by household kind of work that has to happen in order for the rehab to complete and for everyone to feel okay when it's all done.
Okay, if there's no other chiming in on that, I can take another question from the chat. So there's a question from here. So here's the question. The amount of partners and quick collaboration needed to pull off these projects is kind of overwhelming for someone who lives in a small town like me. Do you think these success stories are replicable in more rural places like Monterey, San Luis Obispo, Mariposa? So I guess the question is, what's your advice for organizations who aren't in LA, aren't in Oakland, for how they should go about doing this work in their communities? Maybe Roberto, you want to maybe kick us off with that one?
I was like, ooh, that's I don't have experience working in I do, but it's not in California. I guess what I want to say is that I guess the infrastructure that we built through the LACLT coalition and the CLT pilot program, it did take years to build out. And so I would say that I would really think about how folks are organizing, not only for policies, but how are we organizing in terms of how are we organizing the relationships we have with CDCs and do, like, at least for CLTs, like, is there mission aligned CDCs, or is there potential to work with the CDC to have them move and believe in community ownership and community land trust collaboration? And I think that's a really essential thing, because community land trust, at least for us, the infrastructure hasn't been built out because we don't have the funding sources that CDCs have to build LIHTC like buildings, and the LIHTC has been really oriented for building out like CDC organizations in neighborhoods, and we see that as like, that's great, that's happened in the last 25 years, But now we think that some of those resources and opportunities that CDCs have had could really help build something different in the housing stock that we have today, in terms of changing and building out cooperatives. And so I think it just takes that work. And I'd say that this COT pilot program and the regional infrastructure that we're building at the county level has taken about 15, 20 years to build out. So it just didn't happen one day to another, that it's really did take a lot of organizing, even a lot of, and just a lot of work in terms of getting people to really embody and practice, like wanting to have community control of housing in our neighborhoods. And it could start with the CDC and, changing programming on a local level, or bringing in a CDC that's maybe close to your region, that may be willing to come to you and start thinking about affordable housing development in this way of doing acquisition work. So I wouldn't just rely on your region, but like, is there a closer region that might have resources where they might be willing to do expansion? And I think the Little Tokyo Service Center, a big shout out to Little Tokyo Service Center in terms of how they work and partner with communities outside of Little Tokyo, to be able to bring that resource and to be able to bring that development model that they have, and making sure that the resources actually just stay in that specific neighborhood or city that they're working in. So yeah, I think that's my answer.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to chime in on that one? Sarah, I just want to do a time check because we have 3 minutes left and there's a ton of questions that we'll follow up with, and lots of good ones. But luckily we've got several months to get into some of these questions throughout the session. So I guess with that, I'll just close it then and say thank you so much to Roberto, Abra, and Monica for just sharing your perspectives and answering some of these questions. Just really appreciate you all.
Yes, thank you guys so much. All right, well, with that, we are going to go ahead and close out. We do note that there are many questions still remaining, and the great thing is that a lot of them align with the topics that are upcoming. And so we'll be making sure to answer those in our sessions, and we may also put together some written answers when we send out the recording and the PowerPoint deck for certain questions. A huge thank you again to our guest presenters. Having your real world on the ground experience shared is so critical, and just amazing. So thank you guys so much. I just want to quickly highlight our next session. We'll be meeting again on November 17th, right on Zoom. I do ask that folks register for this session. So I can't see the chat, but hoping that the registration link is getting popped in there again, and we'll send that out with the recording. We're going to be focusing on organizational sustainability and business planning. So how do you make sure that your capacity, mission, alignment, and financial realities are kind of in place as you determine whether or not you want to move forward with small multifamily preservation and operations? We'll have some great local guest speakers again. So Rebecca Foster from the Housing Accelerator Fund and Caroline Fenn from the Mission Economic Development Agency, or META. And look forward to seeing folks there. In the meantime, please do check out the Preservation Toolkit and register for upcoming sessions. Again, thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.